Every girl minutes. After men's.
Yeah, snacks, Dr. Swan.
Oh, snacks? No, I wish I did.
Always working here, she's always got candy.
Yeah, she just got in.
Wow. Did we learn nothing? Eating candy on that empty stomach? All right. Let's see whether or not I can make any sense because I am literally sleepwalking. I need to take a nap for the next 2 minutes. All right. Okay. Good with that. Have a look at page 389. There's a table there that gives you some ideas about equivalent METs for certain sport activities. So that gives you a rough idea of the intensity of those activities if you want to use METs. And then the last aerobic intensity measure is a talk test, which is it's a good way of looking at intensity for beginners, right? The idea is that around 55% of your heart rate max, you would still be able to hold a conversation. All right, so if you go back and look at the range of heart rate max that we talked about for aerobic fitness, then that 55% is on the lower end. So if they're healthy enough to walk, then using the talk test rather than teaching them heart rate max straight away might be a good way to go. All right. Also for people who don't want to train at a particularly high intensity, they just want to work out at a minimum level to gain health benefits, then a talk test can be useful. All right. So those are our aerobic intensity measures. All right. And here's a comparison of some of them. So here's our heart rate, VO2 or Carbonin heart rate reserve, rating of perceived exertion. This is a Borg scale 6 through 20, RPE, and this is what you would be looking at. So we want to be working at moderate mostly. Right? We want to get cardio benefits. So what about progressing then? If I've got someone who's a beginner, what am I going to do with them to help them improve? And we have progressive overload is a principle for XPhys, means I have to keep stressing the system, right? Because we adapt, then once the adaptation for that workload has occurred, if I want to see further improvement, I have to continue to stress the system, which means I have to up the ante somehow. So what's the best way to do that if we're looking at aerobic training? right? So I can start out with something that's relatively low impact, right? So we might be walking or cycling, using an elliptical machine, and one of the ways I could progress is to move that version of aerobic work into something that's more high impact, more high intensity, like jogging. Okay. For some people, that's okay. For other people, if you're working with older people or people who are overweight, that might not be the right version of progressing. Okay? Because high impact work isn't okay for everybody. It does put a lot more stress on your knees, on your spine. Another way we can progress is by changing the time. Right? So what's the duration of the exercise? Our minimal threshold was 20 to 30 minutes, and our max for aerobic improvement is 60 minutes. So that gives me a big window. I could up a few minutes every week or every couple of weeks, add 5 minutes to the length of time that I was cycling or walking, perhaps. Right? And we could also change up the intensity. Right? Now, typically the recommendation is you change the duration first and then you increase the intensity. It kind of depends a little bit though on what the goal of the program is. But usually I'm going to try to get someone to go for longer before I make it harder. Make sure that you do any progression, right? Do them slowly. Don't make big changes. Don't change all three at the same time. All right? Take the progression slowly because we don't want to get anyone injured. We also don't want to run into fatigue issues with someone because we want to keep them engaged. And if they get too tired because we do too big a step at one go, then they might not adhere to the program and drop out. So think about the adaptations that we're looking for in aerobic training. All right? We want to improve cardiovascular health. We want to be able to increase cardiac output. We want to lower blood pressure. There's lots of data that says doing aerobic work makes a big difference to your levels of HDLs. Right? We want those as high as we can. There's a lot of data that says it helps with insulin sensitivity, which is one of the problems for people with diabetes. So for many people with type 2 diabetes, an aerobic program might be a way they can control that without having to resort to meds. Right? Not for everybody, but for quite a lot. All right, so we've got our aerobic column then on your little matrix. All right, what about the resistance column? So duration is really based upon the volume of work that you're going to be doing when we're looking at a resistance program. So that could be a weight room. For most of us, that's probably where we go in our head when we think about the word resistance, because we've all got experience in a weight room. But it doesn't have to be a weight room. It could be bands, it could be ball, could be ankle weights at home, right? It could be body weight. All various options for resistance work. So the total amount of work done then drives how long it's going to take us often, and we can change up the volume to change the focus of the exercise program. So what am I working on when I'm doing a resistance program? Some people might be working on getting bigger, hypertrophy. Some people may be working on being able to maintain muscle contraction, repetitive muscle contraction for longer, so muscular endurance. Some may be looking at strength gains, right? So I can play around with the volume to hit those different focuses, right? And the volume is dictated by the number of exercises, the number of sets for each exercise, and how many reps are in a set. Right? Then, of course, we've got the rest period in between sets to play with. Right? If I increase the rest time within the set, then I'm going to allow the ATP-PC system to recover and not hit fatigue in that system. That would be the kind of thing I would want if I'm working on strength or power, because I want every set to be as high intensity as possible. Right? If I decrease the rest between sets, that works on increasing hormone levels within the muscle, and that would be useful if I'm doing muscular endurance or I'm working on a hypertrophy program. So I want to shorten the rest period to less than a minute over time if I'm working on a strength program, but I want to keep the rest longer than a minute, maybe even 2 minutes if I'm working on a power program. Well, the longer the rest, the longer the amount of time I have to spend in the gym. So you've got to take that variable into account as well. So frequency, there's another table, there's loads of tables in this chapter, so there's another good table there to help you with frequency of training for resistance work. How many times per week is a particular muscle group exercise? The minimum guideline for this column on the fit chart is that each major muscle group should be exercised twice a week. Okay? And at least twice a week, so 2 or 3 times. So I can do that and go to the gym twice a week because I can hit every body part in one session. Okay. Or if I'm more advanced or the goal of the program is slightly different, I can do a split routine. So I do some muscles or some body part on one day and another group of muscles, different body part, another day. Right? So that's good. The goal is each muscle group twice a week. So if I've got someone that doesn't like the gym, right, or they're not particularly interested in getting massive strength changes, then I can send them to the gym just twice a week. Right? Split routines, you can almost train every day. When I was doing a split, a long time ago, when I was your age, I'm a bit older, and we were working on split routines, we were training 7 times a week. Right? We had several days a week where we lifted twice a day, but we did a completely different body part in the second session. Okay? So we were a bit insane. We lived in the gym. And then I found out about sunshine and I gave up lifting. Right? So we've got lots of variability here about how we want to set the program up, depending upon what the goal is and what the individual's preferences are. All right, type of exercise we've already discussed. We want at least one type of exercise per muscle group, right? Typically, not always, but typically we do our multi-joint exercises before our single joint. So what does that mean? what would be if I'm doing legs, what's a multi-joint exercise? Squatting, right? Squatting is a multi-joint exercise. So I'm working glutes, hamstrings, calf, right? Muscles that go across joints, more than one joint moving at a time, right? So I would do leg extensions, single joint exercise, right? Nothing else is moving except my knee. Single joint exercise after squatting, typically, right? There are programs out there where they purposely do extensions first to tire the muscle group before you hit squats. Don't do those with beginners. Don't go there. That would be bad. They won't come back and pay you more money. All right? So think about how you're organizing the program. Okay, so my intensity measure when we look at resistance work is a lot simpler because we only have basically one choice. All right? I've got all those different ways of measuring intensity for an aerobic program, but intensity for resistance is a percentage of your 1 rep max. All right? The higher the percentage, then the more weight you're lifting. The more weight you're lifting, the lower the reps have to be. So those two go hand in hand. I can't have 90% of my 1 rep max and do 15 reps because it's 90% of my 1 rep max, right? So if I can do 15 of them, it wasn't my 1 rep max. Okay? Now, having said that, recommendation if you're not working with athletes or you're not working with people who have experience in the weight room is maybe to use a 3 RM. If you're working with real beginners, you can even use an 8, a 10, or a 12 RM and just make them do 100% of that. Right? 3 RMs are nice because they're a little bit safer. The problem with a 1 RM is I'm putting on the maximum weight I can push. What if I can't push it that day? Right? You've got to have really good spotters or really good safety cages. They've got the new ones down there. I would not do 1 RMs without a partner, at least one partner. Right? It's a very dangerous assessment, a 1 RM, because it's difficult to judge, I think, in a weight room, what is too much. Right? I can just about push this weight, but if I add 10 more pounds, I don't know until I try if I can do it. And what if I can only get halfway through? So 1 RM's percentage of 1 RM, percentage of your max lift, is the measure of how hard you're working. You just might not want to use 1 RMs with all your populations, depends who you're working with. On our progression, again, exactly the same rule. Right? If I want to continue to get further benefits, if I don't want to plateau, I have to progressively overload, progressively stress the muscle group. So I can increase the intensity, right? I can gradually put a little bit more weight on the lift. And I can increase the volume, so I can increase the number of reps and or increase the number of sets, depending on the type of program I'm doing. typically, you're going to increase the volume before you increase the intensity. So again, depends on the program and the level of the person you're working with. There are programs out there that go up in intensity first. But if you are a personal trainer, or you're working with PT students, or you're working with young athletes, and they can do 10 squats with, I don't know, 40 kilos, then make them do 12 squats with 40 kilos, or 15 squats with 40 kilos, and then go back down to 10 squats and put 45 or 50 kilos on. Right? So I'm not saying that's the only way, but the other ways are for people who are more advanced. So it's going to depend who you're working with. And then, of course, the nice thing is you can always play around with these rest periods. Right? Instead of having a 2-minute rest, I can have a 1-minute rest at different times of the year in a different part of my training program. Question? So FIT stands for what? What's the F? Frequency. I. Intensity. First T. Time. Second T. Type. All right. So the idea of FIT applies to aerobic work. It applies to resistance work. It applies to flexibility work. We have less information about what is the right amount of time or the right amount of frequency for flexibility training, but there is some information out there. Also, make sure that you look at that article because they've added a 4th column in now, right? It's not just cardiovascular, resistance, flexibility. We have a 4th column in there that is neuromotor. So now they're starting to look at agility, balance type activities. And we should build that into an exercise program as well. We don't have very much information at all on that one. How many times a week should we do it? What type should we be doing? How long do we do it for? All right? But particularly if you're going to work with children or if you're going to work with the elderly population, but even if you're working with you guys, including balance work, including agility work is important. Your brain has to know how to keep you on balance. Right? You guys are pretty good at that most of the time. But the more you practice it now, the easier it will be as you get older. So it's a really, I think, quite an interesting addition to the FIT matrix that the ACSM have added in there. And I expect that we will get more and more information about what that should look like. If they're telling us, if the guideline is a good exercise program has all these 4 elements in it, how do I do the new 4th element? Right? And that information will come certainly during your career span. Right? So just keep an eye out and be aware of the fact that that's now recommended as part of the program. Okay, so next kind of training then is pretty advanced, right? Interval training is a way of upping the volume of work at a higher intensity without causing quite as much damage or demotivation or fatigue. So the idea is if I have really high intense bursts, but I have little rest periods between them, that we can get more work done over time. There definitely is a link to greater fitness, right? The higher the intensity of the workout, the bigger the fitness benefits the other side up to a point, right? I can increase peak VO2 over what I can do with a steady state program by using interval training. So if I've got someone who's plateauing on their jog or their bike ride, if I change up their training and add some interval training in, I can push their peak VO2 a little bit further maybe. All right, remember we've got a genetic ceiling there, but it's a range. So the plateau may have occurred at the bottom end of their range because the workload wasn't quite hard enough. Okay. I want to create the least amount of fatigue and strain, and this has been shown to be a good way to go about it. You can develop anaerobic capabilities, you can change the program and work on aerobic work, right? I can manipulate the distance of the interval, which would also equate to the duration of the interval. Right? I can manipulate the intensity by playing around with the number of reps and sets for the interval training. What's the rate? I can play around with the rest period. There's loads of things to do. If you're a conditioning coach, then I'm sure that interval training is a lot of fun because you've got so many options available to you. Let me see. So, training intensity then for an interval program is the percentage of the best time for the length of the interval, right? So if I'm going to go 100 meters and my best time for 100 meters is 10.5 seconds, then my intensity for the interval would be a percentage of 10.5 seconds. That's one way of doing it. The other way of checking the intensity is a percentage of your heart rate max for that interval. Right? Remember that intensity is key. If we want to see improvements, we've got to get the intensity right. If we get the intensity wrong, we're less likely to make the goal of the program. Duration for the intervals depends on, let me go back a minute. When I'm looking at this intensity measure, if I want to work the ATP PC system, so if I'm doing intervals with a sprinter or a thrower or a high jumper, right, then this percentage of time or heart rate max needs to be really pretty high. So I'm looking at intervals that are 80 to 100%, 85 to 100%, maybe even 90 to 100% of my best time or my heart rate for the interval. Right? Short, sharp, I'm not going to be running 800-meter intervals at 90% of my heart rate max. Okay? So if I'm training the ATP PC system, this is short, sharp, hard. If I want to work the glycolytic system, then I want my percentage to be 80 to 95, 80 to 90, somewhere around there, once I've got them fit enough to manage that. And aerobic interval training, I can go down to 75, maybe 70. I've seen some that say 70, our book says 75. So I can drop the intensity down, but then the length of the interval is going to be a lot further, right? They're not going to be doing 50 meters if we're training the aerobic system. So duration has the same kind of split, depends which system I want to work, right? So at the beginning of the semester I said, I'm really sorry that we have to do all the hard, ugly stuff first, right? We have to do all that abstract chemistry, biology stuff at the beginning of the semester, which is a hard introduction. But this is why. Right? Because now we get to the more applied stuff, you have to understand the systems to understand the applied stuff. Right? So, ATP-PC system, if I'm going to do intervals to train the ATP-PC system, 5 to 10 seconds at 90% of their max heart rate or 90% of their best time. Glycolytic system, 30 seconds to 2 minutes, right? 80 to 95, 80 to 90% of their best time. If I'm going to train, if I'm going to use interval training to improve aerobic capabilities, then I've got to have intervals that are longer than 2 minutes for each interval, and I've got to be up around 70–75%. I can combine these to meet the needs of a specific sport. So if I'm going to work with footballers, most of what footballers do is ATP-PC. But I need to do some aerobics with them because a game lasts a ridiculous amount of time. Right? Almost as bad as a cricket match, but not quite. Okay? So I can use these. What type of interval do I want to do on a given day? Right? I don't have to do the same one every day. I might do aerobics once or twice a week and sprints once or twice a week, depending upon the percentage aerobic to anaerobic in the game that I'm playing. Number of intervals. How many reps per set? How many sets? What are the goals of the program? Right? Rest periods are interesting when you're looking at interval programs because the rest period can play a key role. Right? The recommendation, if you want to use recovery heart rate, so when we did our step test earlier in the semester, right, and you guys were looking at what your recovery heart rate over the minute after the step test. Remember that recovery heart rate is a very good indicator of aerobic fitness. So if I'm looking at recovery heart rate, one of the ways you can organize your intervals, right? Because I'm going to do my interval and then I'm going to do something that's rest, and then I'm going to do my next interval for however many sets I've decided. Right? You can use recovery heart rate recommendation, wait for it to go back to 140 beats per minute for someone in their 20s, 130 beats per minute for someone in their 30s, 115, I think it is, for someone in their 40s, and 110 for someone in their 50s, something like that. It changes. It isn't a straight 10-beat drop per 10 years. All right? Page 395 has the age range for you. So you do your interval, you wait until your heart rate hits that number, and then you do your next interval, however long that takes. That's one way of doing it. The next way of doing it is a work-to-rest ratio. So if I'm running for 30 seconds and I have a 1 to 2 or a 1 to 3, let's say a 1 to 3. So I run for 30 seconds, my rest will be 90 seconds. Right? I can have a 1 to 2, I can have a 1 to 3, I can have a 1 to 6, I can have a 1 to 1 if I want to, right? I'm going to run for 30 seconds and then I'm going to walk for 30 seconds and then I'm going to run for 30 seconds and then I'm going to walk for 30 seconds or a minute or whatever you want. So work to rest gives you lots of flexibility again, whereas recovery heart rate, you'll see a change over time because as they get fitter, the amount of time it takes their heart rate to recover to that number will get shorter. So the rest period will automatically get shorter as they improve if you use the heart rate. Right. Work to rest, you're dictating what their work to rest interval is, which is okay. And then type of rest, right? Because rest doesn't always mean stop, right? It does for certain interval programs. So if you're doing these very, very short 5 to 10 seconds at 90%, then probably your rest is going to be stop, right? Passive. If you're doing a longer interval, then your rest probably wants to be active but low intensity, like running and then walking, okay, rather than stopping. So training frequency, when we're looking at intervals, they are very, very high intensity. Even if you're doing the longer aerobic ones, this is a lot of work to do in a training session compared to going out for a bike ride, right? So you've got to be a little bit careful with the frequency. If you're working with someone just on general fitness, and they want to do some interval training because just going out for a jog is getting boring, right? Remember, we don't want boredom in a training program because people who are bored quit. Right? So we've got to keep them motivated to keep training. So for some people, interval training is a good way to go because it changes things up a bit. Right? So if I'm working on just general fitness with someone, though, I probably only want to do interval training 1 or 2 times a week because it's a lot of work and we don't want them to get hurt. Okay? If I'm working with athletes, we could do interval training 2, 3, or 4 times a week, depending on what's their sport, what part of the season are they in, right? How hard do they need to work for that sport? Is interval training appropriate? Do I want to do, if I'm doing 4 days a week and I'm giving them a day off, right? Because we're not training 7 days a week, I'm going to have a day off. So if I'm doing 4 interval training, that's only 2 other types of fitness training. That's a lot of work. They've got to be pretty strong to manage that and not get hurt. Does that make sense? All right. So I think intervals are, I wouldn't do them. Personally, I'm not interested in working that hard. Right? But I think intervals are a very good way to go with people who want to get super fit. All right, now they've changed up the stretching information in this one. So I'm going to jump a little bit and talk about a bit of stretching research first before we look at structure. Stretching is really equivocal in the research right now. So I've got different versions of stretching we'll come back to in a minute. Actually, no, let's go there first. Different kinds of stretching possibilities open to me. I can do ballistic stretching, so I can bounce stretch, all right? Bounce stretching is okay if you're working with someone who knows what they're doing, because they will bounce around their range of motion and not bounce through their range of motion and tear something. Because remember our muscle spindles and our Golgi tendon organs, if I stretch the muscle really fast, what's the response to that from the central nervous system? To flex, to contract, right? So if I bounce, then I'm putting a quick, fast stretch on a muscle, and that muscle is going to contract. So ballistic stretching is effective, but I would not use it unless you are absolutely sure the person knows what they're doing. Don't use it with beginners. And if you're using it with your athletes or your PE students, make sure they know what they're doing. Okay? Static stretching is the safe method. Pretty effective, takes a little bit longer to achieve what you want, but it's effective. In static stretching, I'm going to take the range to a point where it's uncomfortable, and I'm going to stay there for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And then I'm going to relax, and then I'm going to do it again. Right? So static stretching will make you more flexible, it will stretch you out, takes a little bit longer to achieve the goal. But it's safe, you can do it with beginners. Just tell them to go till it hurts and stay there. Their version of what hurts generally isn't quite far enough, but at least you're not going to hurt them. Right? A more recent version of ballistic stretching is what is called dynamic stretching. Right? So dynamic stretching means that I'm moving through my range of motion, but I'm not going past my range of motion. I'm not bouncing in any way. I'm just moving within and around my range of motion. So dynamic stretching, probably many of you have heard, is a good way to warm up. So we'll come back to that idea in a minute. The last way is PNF, proprio-neuromuscular facilitation. PNF is much easier to say, right? PNF is cool, really cool, highly, highly effective, right? Needs a partner, so you're going to do it with someone else. And in PNF, we utilize the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindles to the extreme, right? So we had to understand those. In PNF, I push against the partner, so I create a lot of force in the muscle. When I create force in the muscle, what's the response from the central nervous system? Relax, right? So I create force, and then I stop the force, and the muscle relaxes unconsciously as well. And so my partner can push a little bit further than it would have let me go if we had just stretched. Right? So I contract as hard as I can, I create force, the GTO sends a signal, the response is downgrade the force, and I turn the force off, and then we stretch slowly, because we don't want to turn the muscle spindle on. Now we've got the muscle all nice and relaxed. So I push very, very slowly, and we see an increase in range of motion. It's a super effective flexibility mechanism, but we do not want to do it with beginners. And because you're in partners, there have to be some rules. The person who is being pushed gets to dictate where the push stops, not the person doing the pushing. Right? So there has to be some agreed upon signal, smack you in the head, whatever, right? Stop now! That's enough. So, today's Wednesday? All right, on Friday, we'll start here. Remind me to talk about the differences between stretching and flexibility. All right? And then we'll look at structure of the exercise session and we'll move on. I'm gonna try to get this chapter finished Friday so we get 2 days on the special populations. Friday, you need to let me know which populations we're gonna